Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Rob Cox of Breaking Views. Today, I have two great guests from the gearhead world with me. These are two of the best journalists covering automotive industry in this country. I've got Bill Vlasic, who's the Detroit bureau chief from the New York Times with me, and the author of Once Upon a Car, a new book that's just come out. And I've got Paul Ingrassia, who is our own deputy editor here at Reuters, and has his own book coming out on the 15 cars that changed the world next year. But guys, it's a great time to have you in here because we just had a bunch of auto earnings this week. We've had General Motors, in fact, today came out and surprised us all a little bit with something that I thought kind of keyed right into your book, Bill, which is that they said that they've got a lot of restructuring to do. And I find that kind of funny since they just went through a Chapter 11 restructuring that cost billions of dollars for the U.S. taxpayer, and they're still tinkering with the business, whereas Ford seems to be moving mellifluously forward. I mean, what's your sense of what actually happened with this bankruptcy? I mean, you wrote about it quite a bit in the book.
Well, the book is about this reckoning that had been predicted in Detroit for so many years, which ultimately, 3 years ago now, GM led the industry to Washington for a bailout. GM and Chrysler went bankrupt, restructured, and the comeback at GM is slow and torturous to some degree. Ford Motor Company went their own path, turned around without any government money, and I think has a strategy that is bearing fruit in terms of smaller cars, more fuel efficiency, and a focus that we haven't yet to see at GM.
Yeah, I mean, General Motors seems, they did clearly clean the balance sheet. The Chapter 11 filing really allowed them to get rid of all those pension liabilities, well, not all of them, but a lot of them. But you get a sense that still the business, has the culture changed at all at Renaissance Center in Detroit?
Well, the culture at General Motors was so inbred and for so many years, and there was a shock to the system. Rick Wagner, the CEO, lost his job. His successor, Fritz Henderson, lost his job. Now we're on the second outsider, Dan Akerson, as the CEO, and I think he's feeling his way. The contrast with Ford is Bill Ford Jr. is still the chairman, and Alan Mulally, the outsider, which was never expected that an outsider could succeed in Detroit, have charted a path that's it's doing pretty well.
Well, Paul, you've obviously followed Mulally's course over the years.
Right.
He's now getting up there. He's got to be in his late 60s, right?
No, early 60s, but he's
60s, okay.
I'm sorry, mid-60s, excuse me. He's 66 now. But
so how much
consider that young, Rob? I just want to let you know
okay. I didn't, but in the corporate world, that generally is the age of the sort of standard retirement. Where do you think?
Right.
Is Ford going to be okay without? Do they have a succession plan? Is this going to be a sustained rebound for Ford?
Well, they do have a plan. They're just not sharing it with us, obviously. But a
succession plan.
A succession plan, yes, they do. Look, I think Mulally has set a great course here, but obviously the question becomes, and no one's going to know this till he leaves, which is probably, I'm guessing, 2 years. But no one's going to know how much of this comeback is sustainable without the guy who really crafted it and delivered the plan, frankly.
Yeah, and one of the things, Bill, in your book, it's sort of a tale of two men in some ways. Or it's obviously two, there are three companies, but I focused a bit on this. General Motors was fighting this notion that they were an insolvent company, which I will just in our own, Breaking Views wrote in 2005 it was an insolvent company. Just the numbers didn't add up. They fought it, and Wagner was a guy who fought a lot of the ideas that were brought in. Some of them a bit kooky or a little bit radical, like the idea of merging or essentially kind of a three-way with Nissan and Renault. But that brought to mind an interesting point, which is the notion of mergers and acquisitions and M&A. The idea was to cut costs. You've got too much capacity in the industry, too much cost. Are we going to see that rear its head again? Do you think we'll see some more M&A in the industry globally?
Well, one of the outcomes of the bankruptcies was the Fiat Chrysler, which is more than a merger. Fiat owns Chrysler now.
Yeah.
The experience of Daimler Chrysler, as we know, was not a good one. It was the marriage made in heaven that turned into merger hell, and then they split up 8 years later. But as Paul's pointed out to me, it's who's running it, which is important. And Sergio Marchionne is a very strong CEO of both companies. Yeah. And I think that's what Kirk Kerkorian was trying to do with General Motors when he was pushing them rather aggressively to go into an alliance with Renault and Nissan. He was really interested in Carlos Ghosn, the CEO of those two
So
companies.
he was looking for a management change, but there was, of course, an industrial plan behind it, which is purchasing, pool, that kind of thing. In a way, what GM and Fiat had tried to do years before, right? But had failed to.
And Renault Nissan is done well as
so I suppose if
an
Fiat,
alliance.
yeah, and if Fiat works, if the Fiat Chrysler thing continues on the trajectory that people expect it to, and in other words, to succeed. I mean, would that embolden people like, I don't know, Peugeot, Citroën, or some of the Japanese or Asian manufacturers to think about it, Paul? I mean,
they think about it all the time, Rob, but here's the issue. I mean, automobile companies are not just companies. I mean, they're sources of national pride, they're symbols. So, I mean, look, I will guarantee you that when Carlos Ghosn runs Renault, he spends a lot of time on the phone with French ministers and other governmental officials because the French government owns 15% of that company. When he goes off
and
to
they
Tokyo,
employ tons of people in manufacturing.
Yeah, exactly. And in Tokyo, he doesn't have to do all that because it's just the way the Japanese system's a little bit different. So, industrial logic is not all that rules the day here, period.
Right, but I mean, it may not. But at some point, when you talk to these executives, they talk about capacity a lot. That seems to be a word, global capacity. And as a result of everything,
yeah, but
that
it's
happened,
always the other guy's capacity.
Yeah, no. I mean, as I think you pointed, we've talked about this before. Everyone says they're going to increase market share, but everyone's talking about reduced capacity in the industry. You can't. I mean, maybe you can, but if everybody believes they can increase market share without necessarily reducing their own capacity, it ain't going to happen, right? I don't know. I mean, it's just hard to see how that happens.
Well, capacity is one part of the puzzle. The other thing is the product lines. Right. I mean, GM, for example, made too many cars for too long that too many people didn't want. And by eliminating cars that were extraneous and weren't carrying their weight, they're able to build better cars. I think that's pretty simple. And Mullally made some hard calls at Ford by getting rid of Volvo and Land Rover and Jaguar. They liked those cars. Sure. They liked building them. But they weren't making money.
I think, as Mullally once pointed out, all the top executives showed up in those cars at headquarters.
They like driving them too. There's no question about that. But once you get rid of those and you're left with the Ford brand and a limited number of cars, you can make fewer cars better. Fewer cars, better profit margins. And yeah, no, that might work. Well, look, great, guys, it's been great to have you on the show. Bill Vlasic, who's the bureau chief in Detroit for the New York Times and the author of Once Upon a Car. And, of course, Paul Ingrassi of This Parish. Thank you both for coming on. And I'm Rob Cox with Breaking Views. We'll be back with another edition of The Exchange soon.